Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our presentation today, Common Sense Scrum, Why Scrum Gets So Much Resistance. My name is Leah and I will be your moderator today. This session is being recorded and will be distributed after the webinar. For clean audio, we have muted everyone, so please feel free to send questions in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. You can hover your mouse over, you should be able to see that pop up for you. Before we start, here's a little bit about ourselves. Corporate Education Group designs and delivers talent development solutions that align with organizational strategy to transform employee and team performance. More than 30 years of experience rooted in corporate training enables us to engage in collaborative partnerships with clients and tailor solutions that unlock business value. Through our strategic alliance with Duke University Management Training, we offer premier certificate programs backed by a renowned higher education institution. Today's webinar will be presented by Eric Tucker. Eric Tucker, trainer and consultant with CEG, has over 24 years of software and systems development experience and 17 years of experience working with individuals and organizations adopting Agile. Having trained and coached leaders, developers, Scrum Masters, and product owners, Eric is able to work with any skill set and at any level of an organization. His professional experience includes many years as an Agile coach, facilitating Scrum and Kanban events, also coaching team members, setting up and managing Scrum framework, developing and optimizing new teams, and coaching organizations on the benefits of Agile frameworks and mindset. Eric is CST, CSP, SM and SO, a CSM, and CSPO certified trainer and consultant. Eric, thank you so much for being here today. I shall now virtually walk over the microphone to you and turn the presentation over. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Leah, and thanks to everybody for attending. I appreciate you taking your time today. We're going to try and give you as much value as we can in a compressed time frame, and hopefully leave some time for questions at the end. This class, or this webinar, is really about looking at Scrum from the perspective of common sense. Scrum gets a lot of resistance in the world of work, and we want to understand why. So we're going to talk about a little bit about what Scrum is, some of the common benefits and pitfalls, and then, of course, applying common sense. So first, what is Scrum? This will probably be a review for many of you, but here we go. Scrum, as you may know, is a lightweight framework for building things in a way that is cohesive, team-centric, and really focusing on what is most valuable right now, building those things that matter the most now. It's also replete with short development cycles, meaning we get a lot of chances to pause, inspect, and adapt and improve, and then move forward. Scrum consists of 3 defined roles: the product owner, the Scrum Master, and the developer. And of course, Scrum has very specific events that take place throughout the course of the framework. We'll talk about each of those from a common sense perspective today. Scrum teams are meant to be what we call cross-functional and dedicated. And these are 2 areas where, from experience, I know we are often breaking these rules, but we'll talk about that as well. Now, inspecting and adapting is not just about inspecting and adapting on our own way of working and our own processes, but also inspecting and adapting on the quality of what we're doing and on the product that we're delivering to our customers. So when you do Scrum well, what you tend to get out of it are these things. Now, you get more out of it than just these things, but I'm summarizing here. You get motivated teams when you're doing Scrum well. One of the reasons for that is because in Scrum, what we advocate for are teams that are self-managed. Why would that lead to motivation? Well, it's actually pretty simple when you think about it. My parents own rental property, and they rent apartments to tenants. When tenants leave and move on to other places, they tend to leave the apartment a mess. Why? They don't own it. If those same people had a house that they lived in and owned, they would tend to keep it much neater and in well-kept condition. So the message here is when we let teams own their work, they tend to care more about it and become more motivated to do it. And of course, when a team feels like they own the work, the higher quality is what really benefits, what really comes out of it. When they care more about the work, their name is on it. There's a sense of pride associated with it. And of course, that means fewer defects. It's also about continuous improvement. There's no perfect team out there. There's no perfect person out there. So it's all about getting better at what we do consistently and constantly. We also, in Scrum, we treat customers like participants in the process, not observers to the process, unlike other predecessor frameworks like Waterfall and other things like that, where we involve the customer at the very end, showing them what we've built and hoping we hit the mark. In Scrum, we engage the customer throughout the process, each and every sprint. And when I say customer, I'm not referring to internal stakeholders, or not just internal stakeholders. We should include them as well. I'm referring to the people who are going to actually use what was built. We want them involved each and every sprint, giving us feedback so we can potentially pivot toward more valuable things. And of course, the quicker feedback loop, we learn faster, we deliver value faster, we build relationships faster. So one of the first big pitfalls, multitasking. I imagine a couple of you kind of smirked when you saw that slide. We all multitask, and we're all asked to multitask in the world of work. The challenge here is when we multitask, there's a whole lot of bad stuff that comes out of it. When we multitask, what we're hoping to get, if we take a person and put them on, let's say, 3 different Scrum teams, or perhaps ask a person to be a Scrum master for 3 or 4 or 5 different Scrum teams, or same from a product owner, the mindset generally in the world of work is, if I take one person and put that person on multiple teams, I'm potentially getting 3 of that person for the price of 1 of those people. I'm getting 3 Erics for the price of 1. But am I really? Well, facts are these. Multitaskers lose focus more easily. When we multitask, we're actually in the process of rewiring our brains. To digress for a second, I was teaching a product owner class to a pharmaceutical company, and I made the statement that studies have shown that multitasking actually can be a cause for attention deficit disorder. We're actually creating ADD. And I got a bunch of laughs from the people in the class. I was kind of puzzled. And I said, why are y'all laughing? And they said, well, we're actually in clinical trials for a drug right now to combat this, and our findings are consistent with yours. So yeah, this is real. Science is telling us that multitasking causes ADD. It's also going to slow you down. You're not going to get 3 Erics for the price of 1 Eric. And I'm not just going to say that, I'm going to show you that in just a minute. We tend to get a little rude when we multitask. It leads to mistakes, poor quality all over the place. It's bad for your brain. We just covered that. And also, it kind of disrupts your momentum when you're multitasking. You might have some momentum on something that you're working on, and then suddenly you have to shift and pivot. Well, this causes you to unfocus on what was being worked on and then refocusing on something new. And that time can cause a significant lag. According to the American Psychological Association, even brief mental blocks created by shifting focus can cost up to 40% of your productive time. It's a drain. But don't take my word for it. We're going to do a quick game here, and I'm going to share a different screen to show you this little game, and maybe you've seen it before. If not, we'll give you the link to this as well in the notes for this show or for this webinar. I'm going to do a little focused work and then a little multitasking work, and we're going to see the difference in the metrics here. So we're going to start, when I hit the start button here in the upper left, a little blue notebook is going to appear at the top of this maze. And I'm going to have to drag that notebook through the maze. And as soon as I get it all the way through, the maze is going to flip orientation and a green notebook will appear in the upper left. I'll have to drag that through the maze as well. And then it's going to make me do it simultaneously, multitasking. We're going to track the numbers and see what happens. So here I'm going to go, hit and start now. So here's my notebook. I'm dragging it through the maze. All almost done. I'm using a trackpad, so it's a little clumsy. Okay, there's one. Now here comes the green notebook. Okay, now it's going to make me multitask, doing both at the same time. So in other words, this is mimicking the scenario, and this is a very crude example, of course, but it's meant to make a point. This is me working on two different teams in a single day. That's the analogy here. Okay, we're done. Now here's the numbers. As you can see, when I was focused, it took me 7.3 seconds to drag the blue notebook through the maze. When I was multitasking, it took me 25.5 seconds to drag the blue notebook through the maze. So over 3 times longer. And the same metrics are true for the green notebook. As you can see here, the cycle time reduction was significant. The efficiency improvement of focus rather than multitasking was 38%. So if we think about this, we're not getting 3 Erics for the price of 1 Eric. It's actually a paradox. It's actually the exact opposite, that we're actually getting less done when one person is on multiple teams than if they were on a single team and allowed to focus. Now, in the world of work, the argument is this: well, usually from leadership, we don't have enough resources to allow people to focus. We have to get more done by putting them on more teams. But that's the paradox. We do have enough resources. Is the problem that we don't have enough resources, or is the problem that we have too much work in flight at the same time? Because perhaps if we prioritized our work better and did just what we had enough people to do, maybe we'd get more done in less time and be able to get more done over the course of a calendar year. Now, another note, when I was going through this maze, as you might have imagined, when I was focused and doing one thing at a time, I felt very calm, very relaxed, very sure of the work I was doing, not rushed at all. When I was multitasking, I felt stressed. I felt anxious, and I didn't feel like I was doing my best work. Now, the number one cause for people leaving companies is linked to multitasking. So if you think about that, and I'm sure you've all experienced this, you go into work and you have a to-do list for yourself, and you've got a good idea of what you want to accomplish before you arrive at work or start working at home. And then stuff hits you and you're dragged in a bunch of different directions. And at the end of the day, you didn't get to hardly anything or perhaps even nothing on that to-do list. I would imagine that didn't make you feel very good. You probably felt pretty drained and that you didn't really provide a lot of value. If that sustains, if that culture sustains, people leave. People go find other jobs. And if you imagine the cost of replacing someone, it's an enormous cost. It's not just the period of time after you leave and your replacement is acquired. It's the interview process. There's a tremendous amount of expense in finding the right person to replace you. And it's also very expensive to bring them up to speed on what you were doing before you left. So there's a period of time where the company is suboptimal, where they're making far less than they could have had that person stayed. So multitasking is something that feels like it's necessary, but actually it's a paradox. The opposite is what we're looking for. Moving forward here, when we get to the composition of teams is the next thing I want to talk about. In Scrum, we advocate for what we call cross-functional teams. What does that mean? Well, it means that we have all the different skills on our teams to get something from idea to delivery in a single sprint. So if, for example, you were on a marketing team using Scrum, you might have someone who does copywriting. You might have another person who does proofreading. You might have someone who analyzes market analytics and helps understand what marketing methods are going to be the most effective. You might have someone who does image work. This would be a cross-functional team if they were all on one Scrum team. In the world of software, it might be a coder, a couple of coders, maybe a couple of testers, maybe a designer and an architect all together on a single team. Unfortunately, this flies in the face of the way many companies are structured. Many companies are structured in what we call component teams. What are component teams? Well, a component team would be defined as a team of people that have the same skill set. For example, a design team. Maybe there's a design team that consists of a bunch of people who do user interface work, graphic work, user experience work. And maybe there's another team alongside this design team that does nothing but coding, and a third team that does nothing but testing. What we create in that dynamic is kind of what you're seeing in this graphic here, the relay race notion in the Olympics, where one runner hands the baton to another runner. Well, think about what happens if that baton drops. One wasn't ready to receive it, or one handed it over too quickly. The baton drops, and now both runners have to stop and retrieve the baton and repeat the process of passing. This analogy is depicting what happens in the world of work when one team, let's say, is ready to hand off something to another team, but that other team isn't ready to receive it yet. Or vice versa. We're waiting on you, but you're not giving it to us yet. So what this does is creates what we call wait states. It's suboptimal time where we're sitting around not doing anything productive, waiting to be handed something that we need to work on. There's also quite a bit of explanation that needs to accompany that handoff, so more inefficiency. So the challenge here is this, as opposed to having a team where designers hand off to coders who then hand off to testers, the challenge is to put everybody together on a single team. And maybe some of you right now are shaking your head going, my company's never going to do that. Oh, okay, maybe they won't, but maybe we can create a compelling case where they would. So some of the challenges that get solved here, if you look at the cross-functional matrix, the NASCAR pit crew. If you look at this picture, you see there's one person, the car just pulled in, there's one person filling it with gas, another person's jacking up the right side of the car, one person's taking off tires, one person's handing them new tires, one person in the front is cleaning off the windshield so the driver can see, and this car is in and out of that pit in less than 20 seconds. Okay, that's what a cross-functional team looks like. Why do handoffs when we can all work simultaneously together and deliver value fast? The other real big downside to this component model here, when does the customer see anything? If we're taking a period of time to design something and then code something and then test something, we could be talking about several sprints worth of time before a customer actually gets to see anything worth commenting on. Well, here's the other problem with component teams, and this is kind of leading into what can be done about it. The reason component teams are so prevalent, in my experience of working with companies large and small, is because if we have that team of just coders, they usually all report to the same person. They have the same boss. So therefore, that boss is kind of able to control that team. In the cross-functional matrix here, you probably have 5 or 6 different specialties all working for 5 or 6 different bosses. So there's no one particular person in leadership that has control over this team. How can we help make that transition from component to, from component to cross-functional teams? First thing we need to do is be empathetic with those leaders that are in this position. If you think about it, leadership became leadership because they played the game by the rules that used to exist. They were really good at delegating, really good at controlling, really good at being on top of everything. In order for them to acquiesce and let us have cross-functional teams, they need to become comfortable with not having control. And that's going to be difficult, folks. And this is not because they're necessarily control freaks, and certainly not because they're bad people. It's because they're used to a certain way. And this new way feels very foreign. And most of us are resistant to change in the first place. So let's start with being empathetic with leadership who is being placed in an awkward position. Remember, these leaders, they have mortgages, they have car payments, they have students in college, kids in college. Then, there's, I'm sure, a ton of obligations on them too, just like us. So putting them in a position where they need to surrender control, in other words, give up everything that made them successful to this point, has got to make them feel a little bit uncomfortable. So maybe we start there. And the next thing we can do is track the data and make a case for transitioning from component team to cross-functional team. Data is very compelling. If we track the wait time it takes to get a handoff from one team to another and equate that to dollars, opportunity lost, it's a very compelling number. Next, we're going to talk about Scrum events. Now, there are 5 events in Scrum. There's the sprint itself, there's sprint planning, the daily Scrum, the sprint review, and the sprint retrospective. There's also an activity we sandwiched in there called backlog refinement, or product backlog refinement, to be more specific. And one of the things that I have found in my 18 or so years of being involved in this world of Agile is when companies adopt Scrum, a lot of times what they'll do is sort of cherry pick the events that they want to do and then disregard the others. This is a mistake. Scrum has been around for 25 years. The current version of the Scrum Guide is based on all the knowledge acquired during that time. Scrum is a very well-established, refined framework that does a great job. And to take just little pieces of it and exclude the rest would be a mistake, because what Scrum's superpower is not helping you build things that are awesome. It does that too. Its real superpower is exposing what you're doing wrong. And we can't get that benefit of knowing exactly what we're doing wrong unless we do the whole framework inclusively. Everything is in there for a specific reason. And if we miss one thing, we're not going to get the full benefit. So let's talk about the first thing, the sprint itself. One of the things we like to do in some cases in the world of work is make the sprint duration elastic. Maybe it's 2 weeks for the first 7 sprints, but then in sprint 8, we have a lot of work to do. So we're going to make sprint 8 3 weeks long and then go back to 2 weeks. This would be a mistake, and this would be against the way that Scrum was designed, because the sprint time box, anywhere from 1 week on the low end to 1 month on the high end, is designed to be static in duration. The reason, it keeps us consistent, and it's going to help make the team predictable. From a business perspective, predictable teams are a huge asset. If we have an idea of what we can expect out of a team 6 to 12 months from now, because they're so predictable, we can make accurate forecasts from a business perspective to our stakeholders. And of course, at the team level, if you are consistent with the duration of your sprint and predictable, now it's easy to plan sprints. It's easy to know what is achievable in a sustainable pace and what is not. It's also really, it builds up really good habits in us. It helps us schedule recurring events. For example, let's say the sprint review, done on the last day of the sprint, usually just prior to the retrospective, is an event where we want to include outside stakeholders, customers or users of our products. Well, if we can put that as a recurring meeting on their calendar, that it happens at the same exact time every single sprint, they're more likely to attend because they can plan for it. If that date is constantly shifting and that time of the event is constantly shifting, they're less likely to attend. And now we miss an opportunity for feedback, helping us pivot in a specific direction that's more valuable. So keeping sprints consistent in duration is extremely important. Now, the next thing, sprint planning. I unfortunately have seen this go very wrong in many, many cases. The first thing we do in a sprint, in the sprint planning meeting, is plan a sprint goal. Why do we plan a sprint goal? Well, the goal is supposed to be a statement about what we want to achieve as a team in the sprint itself. So by the end of the sprint, we want X. Awesome. Why have the goal in the first place? It builds team. A team cannot be successful unless they have trust and a common goal. And we reinforce this every single sprint by the team picking for itself the goal. Now, if the team works well together during the sprint and achieves the goal, what do you think happens? They celebrate it. They feel good about it. It bonds them together. And simultaneously, if they work well or work hard and not necessarily to their best capacity and don't achieve the sprint goal, well, that's a learning experience too. They feel disappointed in themselves and they don't like feeling that way. So they work harder next time to avoid that same outcome. So planning a goal, massively important, every single sprint. The other two parts, the what and the how shown on the slide here, I've seen these done in part or halfway. Let me explain to you the benefit here. The what part of sprint planning, it's when the product owner and the developers get together and based on the priority given to the sprint, to the product backlog, the developers pick what they're going to work on. They pick in priority order, and maybe they have a couple of questions they want to pose to the product owner just prior to committing to that work. So that's why the product owner should be present at the what part of sprint planning to answer questions and give reassurance. Remember, the developers are picking work and they're committing to finishing it. So they need to be careful about their commitment. They can only really pick work that they feel confident they can finish. So the product owner might have to give them some final bits of clarity before the developers feel comfortable making that commitment. But now the next part, the how. This is the final part of sprint planning, and this is the part I've seen most often overlooked. In the how part of sprint planning, here's what happens. This cross-functional, dedicated development team gets together and swarms one work item at a time. Let's say, and I'll use the term user stories because I know many of you are familiar with user stories. Let's say we've pulled in a few user stories into our sprint, and now we're at the how part. That's when the developers, this cross-functional team, swarms on a single user story. And together, they identify all the subtasks that are going to be needed to get that story all the way to done. Why is this the preferred approach as opposed to people sort of disappearing off to their cubicles and typing in the tasks that they're going to do in Jira or some other tool? The reason is when we swarm on something, if that's 5 or 6 or 7 pairs of eyes swarming on a single story, we're less likely to miss details. Second, we're going to start to learn about what other members of our team are working on and what their expertise is. And last, it might even identify opportunities for collaboration. Imagine if you're a coder and one of the subtasks you've put together for this user story is write a web service that does X, Y, and Z. Well, someone else on the team might say, you know what, I wrote a web service like that like 6 months ago. It does most of this stuff. I have some code that you can reuse, like opportunity to collaborate, right? So now a more 360-degree view of the work. Now, the next event, the daily scrum. I love this photo. So the daily scrum is one of those very misunderstood events. It's supposed to be 15 minutes long. I've heard so many people say, oh, our daily scrum is 45 minutes, an hour long. Yeah, not real valuable when it goes that long. It can be very tiring. This event, the daily scrum, is owned by the developers. It's their meeting. All too often, I've seen observers, stakeholders, managers attend and sort of take over the meeting and make it a status meeting, prompting people to give updates. I've even seen product owners and scrum masters behave that way. This event is meant to be owned by the developers. It's their meeting for them and by them. And the purpose of this meeting is for them to share what they've learned in the last 24 hours and talk about what they're planning on doing in the next 24 hours, raise any impediments, and identify opportunities to collaborate. Now, some folks want to observe daily scrums. That's fine if the developers allow it. Remember, this is the developers' meeting. Status meetings are boring. Status meetings are not interesting. They're not fun. The daily scrum should be a meeting that the team enjoys having because it helps them collaborate on a daily basis. And believe it or not, the product owner and the scrum master are both optional attendees. Why would the scrum master be an optional attendee at the daily scrum? Well, maybe we're not understanding the role fully. The scrum master has 2 chores with regards to the daily scrum. 1, that it happens, and 2, to teach the team how to do this event in 15 minutes or less. Once those things are accomplished, it's a recurring habitual meeting, and once the team knows how to conduct it themselves, the Scrum Master is literally an optional attendee. I never recommend that Scrum Masters don't attend because it's too valuable, but technically they are optional. As a Scrum Master, when I did that role, I was always there, taking copious notes on what I was observing, excuse me, and also making sure that there was nothing in the team's way. This is a great place to figure all that stuff out as a Scrum Master. But if we were to avoid doing the daily Scrum or not do it daily, sometimes I see people doing it 2-3 times a week, you're losing a lot of opportunity to plan that day in the next 24 hours of work and to collaborate. Here's one that gets missed all the time: product backlog refinement. So what is it? What's the purpose of it? The purpose of product backlog refinement is to get items ready to come into a sprint. Let me say this another way. Backlog refinement is the gatekeeper for something going from product backlog into sprint backlog. Said even another way, nothing should ever get into the sprint if it hasn't been through product backlog refinement. That said, what is it? Well, it's when the whole Scrum team gets together and has a conversation about upcoming work. The whole team. So let's think about this. The Scrum Master, what does he or she doing? They are facilitating this conversation. They are not taking part in it. They are not solutioning anything. They're not telling anyone what to do. And what do I mean by facilitating? It is not putting a calendar invite on your Outlook screen. That is not facilitating. Facilitating is keeping track of an agenda, time boxing conversations, making sure everyone gets a chance to speak and no one's dominating the conversation, making sure people aren't interrupting each other, making sure off-topic items get captured in a parking lot, making sure actions and decisions get captured and owned by individuals. That's just the surface of facilitating, but that's what your Scrum Master is doing. Product owner's job in backlog refinement is to know everything about what is being discussed. The product owner has an enormous amount of prep work to do before getting to backlog refinement. They have to know what is desired by the customer. They have to know what this item we're talking about is all about and be able to answer virtually any questions the developers have about the item being discussed. The developer's job is to ask questions and to truly understand this work. Now, what if we skip backlog refinement or don't do it effectively? There's a huge chance that we're going to build the wrong thing. What that means is we're pulling work from our product backlog into our sprint without knowing enough about the work and building it wrong or building the wrong thing. And furthermore, it might even necessitate this other common faux pas, which is changing the composition of a work item during a sprint. Let's talk about what happens there. Let's say you're a developer and you've been working on a piece of work for a couple of days, and suddenly a whole bunch of things about that work change. And on the morning of day 3, you're told, all that stuff you've been doing for the last 2 days, you're going to need to scrap about 75% of it because I've made a change to this piece of work because we didn't really understand it before we pulled it into the sprint. Well, now you've got a frustrated developer who's going to now have to rush to make those changes in the time box of the sprint, which we learned we do not extend. And when we rush, we make mistakes. And the one who suffers from that the most is our customer. And they're the ones that are going to find those mistakes for us. So common sense, we don't change items of work once they're in a sprint. How do we prevent that from being necessary? We do good backlog refinement of that item before it ever gets into the sprint. So the sprint review is our next item. This one is vital from the perspective of our product itself. So the sprint review, often confused with the term sprint demo, they are one and the same, but it is called the sprint review, is an opportunity for us to show whatever it is we've built to our stakeholders, internal and external. The mistake here is inviting just internal stakeholders. We want to invite customers and users as well. And how do you know who your customers and users are? Well, There's a story I tell in class. When my now 17-year-old daughter was 8 years old, I made her a deal. Academics are very important to me. I wanted to make sure she got good grades. So I told her at 8 years old, if she got no grade lower than a B from that day until she was old enough to drive, I would buy her a car. Well, unfortunately, she kept her end of the deal. And when she turned 16, we went car shopping. And in that transaction, the customer is me, because I'm the one buying the car. And the things I care about are things like safety and getting the best car for the lowest price and reliability. My daughter is the user in this experience. She doesn't care at all about safety or reliability. What she cares about is the color of the car, how fast it goes, and the stereo system. Well, we're both stakeholders. I'm a customer, she's a user. And in this case, the business stakeholder is the car dealership, and they want things like repeat business from me. They want to maximize their profit and their revenue. And so therefore, we have competing goals. As a customer, I have a competing goal with the business. If I'm showing a product at a sprint review and I'm only inviting the dealership, think about all the perspective I'm missing by not inviting the customer and the user as well. The anti-pattern I've seen all throughout the world of work here on this one is that we only invite internal managers to our sprint reviews. We are missing a massive opportunity to know what it is our product, our customers value by hearing it from them firsthand. Don't be afraid of bad feedback. Bad feedback is just as important as good feedback. It's all helping us understand where we need to pivot. And that's the purpose of that sprint review. And again, it should happen every single sprint. And we want to encourage as much outside attendance as possible. Another thing I've seen, by the way, is sometimes because we're not including customers and users at that sprint review, I'll see managers asking us to make changes in our product backlogs that they think are worthwhile and necessary, but aren't necessarily what the customer or users want. So it's in conflict a little bit with where we think we should be going with our product. In that case, one of the best remedies is to have a sprint review where you invite both audiences, internal management and customers and users. And that way, internal management's hearing the same stuff you're hearing. And they know better than anybody that the word of the customer trumps all else. That problem can solve itself. 2 more to go here. This next one is the sprint retrospective. One of the things you'll hear a lot is, well, we have too much work. We don't have time for the retrospective. Well, this would be a huge mistake, because the point of the retrospective is to reflect on every piece of data we have from that sprint and see where we have weaknesses in our process. Any weaknesses or inefficiencies in our process are going to lead to more time spent less efficiently. So we need to figure out what's working and celebrate it, what isn't working and fix it, and how do we change and pivot toward a better outcome. So if you're doing 2-week-long sprints, you get 26 of these every year. Imagine having 26 times in a calendar year to reflect on your own process and see where it can be improved. Last, definition of done. Definition of done is all too often a tool that is overlooked and not seen in Scrum teams. I can't advocate enough for a good definition of done. Imagine, if you will, you do have a cross-functional team. You've got designers, you've got testers, you've got coders, you've got architects. If you're doing software, if you're doing marketing, you have that cross-functional team that handles things like image composition, copywriting, legal, analytics. How we know something is done has to consider all of those perspectives of everyone on that cross-functional team. So what this produces is a team understanding of what done means, as opposed to an individual understanding. If we go back to the world of software, can you imagine that done to a coder would be very different than done to a tester? Well, if this is individualized, this dynamic continues. Done from a coder's perspective, done from a tester's perspective. But if the coder and the tester together are creating the definition of done, they're both fully cognizant of what's in it. And they both know when not to say the word done because not everything has been met on that checklist of definition of done. If we miss our defects in the course of building our work and we put those defects into production, our customers are going to find them for us. And that leads to a damaged reputation and probably the loss of those customers over time. So just keep in mind, folks, when it comes to the work that comes out of a sprint, there's two possible statuses for that work: done and not done. Now, omitting any of these things from your Scrum implementation is going to slow your ability to learn what you're doing wrong. This is the big reason from a common sense perspective that Scrum doesn't get adopted in the world of work. We don't like having our problems thrown in our faces. We don't like knowing we're not doing things well. In general, I'm not speaking about all of it, everyone, but in general, that's the case. That's the natural resistance to this, and that's what we need to fix. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Leah, and
Yes.
Let's see if we have any questions from our group, and we'll be happy to address any ones we can.
Great, Eric. In fact, we do have a bunch of questions in. I'll start with Norris. He did send in a couple of questions. Recent one was, how do you view, I guess, in relation to sprint retrospectives, how do you view a public sector situation with many clients?
A public sector situation with many clients. Okay, I think maybe he meant the sprint review, not the retrospective, but I'll address both. So with regard to the retrospective, this is a private event just for the members of the Scrum team. The retrospective, where we're reflecting on our process and trying to find places to improve. So we wouldn't have any outside attendees at the retrospective. We would need to obviously know what many of them think, because that might guide some of our discussions in the retro, but the retro is private. As for the sprint review, it's not uncommon, even in the public sector, to have many different clients and many different perspectives. When we're talking about who to invite to the sprint review, the product owner needs to have a good handle on what's being built in that sprint and who would be the audience most likely to be interested in what we've finished in that sprint. Who would be the audience that has the most at stake with what we've just built, and who would be the audience that we think would give us the most feedback. That's the audience we want to invite, regardless of what company they work for, et cetera. And frankly, we don't care if people from multiple companies attend our sprint reviews. If they're going to give us good feedback on the product, they should be there. And the product owner needs to make sure they make those invitations happen. I hope that helps you. And
Thanks,
what's the next one, Leah?
Yep, Farika says, I am running a lean project using a few Scrum methodologies, and I'm having difficulties with daily Scrum buy-in from the team.
Yeah, not uncommon. Daily Scrum buy-in. Well, first of all, let's remember that if this is something new to them, everyone's resistant to change by default, right? What we need to do to get buy-in is to show them the value of that meeting. So, and this, by the way, I would say is a statement I could apply blanketly to any change that's needed. No one's going to change unless they see the value in behaving another way. So the daily Scrum, here's what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be short. It's supposed to be energetic. It's supposed to be an update on what has happened in the last 24 hours, what will happen in the next 24 hours, and then, of course, the chance to surface any problems that they're facing and that are in their way. If this meeting goes beyond 15 minutes, people are going to feel the way you've just described. If this meeting happens in 5 minutes, it's amazing how much more valuable it will be in their perspective and how much more enthusiastic they'll be about attending it. No one likes to be in long meetings when there's a lot of work to be done. So the best advice I could give you in facilitating such an event would be to set the stage. Why are we here? What do we hope to accomplish? We want to do this in 15 minutes or less. And oh, by the way, this is not a meeting to do a lot of solutioning conversation. We don't want to prolong this meeting. As a facilitator, I would then add this. If there are a need for greater detailed conversations, As soon as the last person in this team has given their update, we will then allow for time for future or further discussions for those who want to stay for those discussions. If you segment your meeting that way, chances are people will find it more valuable and maybe be a little more enthusiastic about it. Thanks for the question.
Great, Eric. And from Andrew, back to component teams. Andrew writes, in traditional construction projects, component teams look like they are inevitable. What is your take, Eric?
Great question. And Andrew, I think, was it Andrew? Was that his name?
Andrew.
Andrew, excellent. So Andrew, I was just thinking about this because I'm considering getting into the house flipping business, right? And buying houses and renovating them and so forth. And I have every intention of doing this in a Scrum environment. I'm going to hire a cross-functional team, electricians, plumbers, carpenters, HVAC, all that. And I'm going to put them together on a single team with the objective that they all know what each other's doing and coordinate their efforts. But also, I want the electrician to learn about plumbing, and I want the plumber to learn about HVAC, et cetera. Yeah, it does definitely go by default, and especially in that industry, because it's such an old industry, that people would be in component teams. But the cross-functional side of it is exciting, right? Because you're going to learn new skills, and maybe you're not that kind of person that wants to learn new skills if you're in that industry. But oftentimes, I find that when people learn something new, they get excited. So it all starts with leadership and helping them see the value of being a cross-functional team. Put together that NASCAR pit of construction teams. I think you'll find that they get a lot done pretty fast with a lot of quality.
Thank you, Eric. And Michelle did write in that she loved the pit crew analogy earlier on in your slides.
Nice.
Okay, I'm just scrolling through. We do have another question in. 1 second. And yes, to those that wrote in, a copy of the recording will be posted to everybody tomorrow. So the next question in from Basant, is it possible to have some definition of done and acceptance criteria to say sprint complete?
Good question. All right. So I'm a big advocate of definition of done, but there's this other perspective called acceptance criteria. So for those who don't know, and thank you for giving me the chance to explain this, acceptance criteria is work specific. So if we're, again, using the vernacular user stories, one user story is going to have its own acceptance criteria. And that acceptance criteria is going to be different for each user story. Definition of done, I want you to think of it as this. It's a basic checklist of development best practices. And unlike acceptance criteria, there is one definition of done document. And all the stories that we build must adhere to that one document. So it is a one-to-many relationship. All work adheres to one definition of done, whereas each piece of work can have its own acceptance criteria. 2 more points on this to make it even more clear. Definition of done means that a piece of work is done from the perspective of those who built it, the developers. It means done from developers' perspective. Acceptance criteria means something is done from the perspective of the user who's using what we built. If we worked for Amazon, and let's say we had a user story that read, as an Amazon user, I want to search for books by keywords so that I can find the book I want to buy. Maybe that's the story. How the user would know that story is done, meaning acceptance criteria, is, well, they can enter a keyword in the search box, they can press enter to start the search, and they can see the results, and the results match the keyword that was entered. That's acceptance criteria. That's the user's point of view. In a definition of done, we might have things like, well, we have a cross-browser compatible display for entering the keyword. We have stored procedures interacting between the code layer and the data layer. We're using this kind of SQL statement. We're unit testing our code. We're regression testing the code. We're all these other tests and so forth that we might want to do on it. We're doing, all of our code has been peer reviewed. It's well commented and outlined and so forth. Those would be examples of things that would be in our definition of done. So the two exist simultaneously. Definition of done means what was built to the highest level of quality. And acceptance criteria means we built the right thing. right? I had a coach in my past who was just amazing, and he shared something with me I'm going to pass on to you. He said, acceptance criteria helps us build the right thing. Definition of done helps us build the thing right. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Eric. Yep, we have a couple more in. We see the time. Oh, we have time for a couple more. Let's see here. Amy says, when talking about, okay, let me just see if there's not duplication. When talking about acceptance criteria and definition of done, where does MVP, minimum valuable product, fit?
Great one. Okay, so MVP is a term that comes from a different framework under the Agile mindset called Lean. And if there's a great book out there called The Lean Startup, written by a gentleman named Eric Ries. Definitely recommend checking out that book. In that book, Eric Ries defines the term MVP as this: testing your riskiest assumptions. So think about that. In the world of business, we have assumptions. How do we test them? To either validate that they're true or invalidate them as false. That is essentially what MVP is. What assumptions do we have about what the customer wants and what they don't want? And then how do we test them to see if we were right? In that way, in the world of Scrum, we don't use the term MVP, but if you go by that definition, to me, it feels a lot like the sprint itself is an MVP, because we're going into the sprint making certain assumptions about what the market wants and what the customer wants. So we plan and we build those things. And then at the end, when we show it to our customer, we're actually either validating or invalidating those assumptions. So in that way, I feel like a sprint is minimum viable product. Great question. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. And from Mohammed, Mohammed writes, can you please elaborate how to manage a team in Scrum in case you have a high-tech person, but he cannot communicate with the team and usually makes resistance with other team members?
So I don't know if we can ask him for clarification, or maybe I'll just answer from two different perspectives. Can't communicate, does that mean a language barrier or that the person's just a bad communicator? So we'll go from both perspectives. So the language barrier one, I mean, obviously that the only real way to fix that is to either learn his language or he learns yours. Don't have a better answer than that one. But in terms of if this person's just a poor communicator, I don't know that I would involve myself in managing that person, but I would certainly involve myself in coaching that person. The Scrum Master on a Scrum team, as part of their job, they're a coach. And coaching is really about one-on-one conversations, helping people find their own answers and becoming the best version of themselves. Sometimes when people are simply poor communicators, it's because they don't really understand the dynamics that communication is the responsibility of the speaker. So they have to be compelling. They have to be worthy of being listened to. They have to have the credibility of their audience. Some one-on-one coaching might help there, because I would imagine this individual may not even be aware of how they're being perceived. Sometimes as a coach, one of the first things I would do is make someone aware of how they're being perceived. And if they don't like it, they're motivated on their own to change that. I suspect we could have a deeper conversation about that, and I'm happy to. And what I would say also to Leah is, when we share this recording, if you wouldn't mind publishing my email address, so if this person wishes to have a deeper conversation, we can do that.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
From Mark, can Scrum be used in teams that have multiple concurrent projects? And in parentheses, it writes custom off the shelf, not building a new product, where only one or two team members are assigned to a project. And okay. I can repeat that if you want me to.
So I think I got the gist. We have only two people on a team and we have concurrent projects. And we use Scrum. Is that kind of what
yes.
You're okay. So the typical minimum size of a development team in Scrum is kind of recognized to be 3 people. And the reason for that is because it's hard to be cross-functional with less than that. But if you can pull it off with 2 people, if they have all the skills needed to take something in your backlog from idea to done, then that's fine. Can you use Scrum? Well, I'll ask the question back to you rhetorically. Would working in a sprint time box benefit you? Would planning the sprint, coordinating your efforts every day, showing at the end what you've built to your stakeholders, and then reflecting on your process to try and improve, would all of those things benefit you, regardless of the work that you're doing? If the answer is yes, then I think Scrum's a good fit. If the answer is no, once again, when Leah publishes the email, if you want to talk more about that privately, I'm happy to jump into that. I think I need a little more context on your issue, but I hope that helps for now.
Great. Thank you, Eric. Okay, we do have time for one more question, and this one is in from Basant. Oh, and great presentation, by the way. We're coming in for a few folks here. Loving your webinar today. Okay, so just scroll it back up here. How do you take SME for specific skills required? Only part-time, not a dedicated team in Scrum. How do you take?
Okay, so I think this person is asking about a subject matter expert that is vital to their team's success, but they're only part-time. That's a doozy. So here's what I would suggest. First of all, if we're relying heavily on outside SMEs, it's because we need to, right? Because the people on our teams don't have all of the expertise needed, so we're relying on the SME. If they're only part-time, here's what I would do if I were you. I would invite them to backlog refinement sessions when the work that's going to be discussed is very specific to their area of expertise. Invite them into that backlog refinement session so they can take part in that conversation and begin to share their knowledge with the developers that are on your team. One of the SMEs are great. I love SMEs. One of the things we want to try to do with SMEs in our world of work is get what's in their head into everyone else's heads. Heaven forbid your SME wins the lottery and you no longer have access to this person. You know, you're up the creek in that case. So we want to try and get as much out of their heads as possible. And if they're only part-time, let's really be careful about coordinating having our backlog refinement sessions when the SME can attend. Hope that helps.
Thank you, Eric. And that's about it for questions today. If you'd like to carry on the conversation, you can always post those questions over on our LinkedIn page. I've just posted the link to that in the Q&A box. And if you are interested in having Eric deliver a virtual or customized workshop, keynote, or other professional development program at your organization, we would like to speak with an enterprise training advisor, you can call us at 1-800-288-7246 or email us at info@corpedgroup.com. CEG can also develop a tailored training program based on your specific talent development challenges and goals. Connect with one of our enterprise training advisors to discuss which talent development solutions will best fit your needs, or visit our website at www.corpedgroup.com. Again, you can further your questions out on the LinkedIn group page, and don't forget that this webinar does qualify for 1 PDU. The course number for this webinar is MDW 2025. I'll repeat that one more time, MDW 2025, and it can be reported under Category A. Our PMI provider number is 1011. Feel free to contact us and check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. We love to hear from you. And Eric, we are getting a lot of comments in. Everybody saying great session, lots of learnings, first time exposure. Thank you very much.
Appreciate everybody coming. I had a great time.
And with that, have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody.